So I was listening to this video from an Orthodox Christian, and it was about was America ever a Christian nation or something, right? And I was like arguing with him a little bit because he was finding all these bizarre reasons why it wasn't. Like he was trying to say that something about Queen Elizabeth or something, New England, and being the head of the church or something, and then saying that Jesus' name is not anywhere in the Constitution, and that what else is like, and I was arguing with him, and he was trying to say that I have to be able to prove it legally or something. I don't know why. It's like our legal system is like not entirely faithful, right? Because you have the Dred Scott case, Roe versus Wade, a bunch of things that are actually not reflecting our founding, right? Or anything, like, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of, like, I guess he assumes a Supreme Court or something, but then, you know, that's not entirely correct. You know, those councils, Supreme Councils, those American councils, you know, they're not infallible. You know, they make a lot of stupid mistakes. Like, but as far as, like, legally, I mean, I don't know, like, I guess, yeah, I could still try. I could actually prove that. I could still prove him wrong on that basis, because I mean, I have this book, The Myth of Separation, right, from David Barton. A revealing look at what the founders and the early courts really said, right, about church and state and stuff like that. It says, what is the correct relationship between church and state? And in the back, it just says, did you know that separation of church and state is a myth, right? But, I mean, personally, like, I don't really believe it's a myth. Like, when James Madison talks about, he asked the question of, is an establishment of religion necessary for religion itself, right? Which is why you can't say that an establishment of religion, right, that Congress shall respect no law, shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. How that doesn't mean it's a disestablishment of the entire religion. It just means it's an establishment of the religion itself, like a church or a mosque or something, like an institution of that religion, which is exactly what it means. That doesn't mean to remove religion entirely to the point where you create like a pure secular nation, which is no religion, no God, and it's religiously indifferent, secularly neutral, right, on religion, and where it doesn't favor any religion, which I've made plenty of videos like refuting that our founders do not reflect that kind of thinking. They don't reflect that kind of separation. You know, like, they're actually more favorable to the religion that they criticize, right? Like Jefferson criticizing Christianity and yet venerates its founder, even calling his system the superior form of religious system, right, or philosophy of morals and precepts and things like that. And then, I mean, I do go over it in my other video. Like, there are plenty of numerous founders that said this, not just the Christian ones, but also the so-called theistic ones, like how they don't actually agree with the irreligious tendencies or atheism or deism, where it's like based on concept rather than experience or revealed religion, because they were going after true and blessed religion. That's what they really wanted. Well, anyway, it says here that it just says that this book proves that the separation of church and state is a myth by using the quotes of the founding fathers and the actual decisions of the Supreme Court from 1795 to 1952. So notice these brief excerpts from the founders. Quote, the highest glory of the American Revolution was this: it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity. End quote. John Quincy Adams. Quote, it cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists but by Christians, not on religions, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ, end quote. Patrick Henry. Quote, Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is the duty of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers, end quote. That's John Jay, first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And he just talks about a French historian visiting the United States in the 1830s made these observations. Quote, upon my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck my attention. The Americans combined the notions of Christianity and of liberty so intimately in their minds, that it is impossible to make them conceive the one without the other. Religion in America must be regarded as the foremost of the political institutions of that country. From the earliest settlement of the immigrants, politics and religion contracted an alliance which has never been dissolved, end quote. That's Alex de Tocqueville. Yeah, because I was listening to these other Orthodox Christians, right, or Christians on this video that I'm talking about, and they think that the founders didn't want religion at all in government. That's why they separated it. But I said, no, they did not create a purely secular nation or government. Like, they still practiced national days of fasting, Thanksgiving, and prayer, even locally with Jefferson, and even afterwards nationally with James Madison or so. And so, which proves that they were not, without religion. I mean, it kind of proves that they did not favor this no religious kind of tendency that the secularists want you to believe. They certainly were involved with religion, but it's just like I said, that what James Madison asked: do you really need the church for the Christian religion in general, like an established church, right? Which tends to, as from what they've learned from experience, that having is a real strict union of church and state, right, produces bad religion and bad government. Which is, bad religion is what they're trying to stay away from. But the cure for that and religious indifference is true and blessed religion. It's not religious indifference and neutrality where everyone's religion is equal and you can just start your own religion or something. You say, no, that would be like spreading even more corruption and confusion. And that the fact that there is such a thing as bad religion, it's like you can't really be neutral on religion. This is from the court. Quote, no free government now exists in the world unless where Christianity is acknowledged and is the religion of the country. Its foundations are broad and strong and deep. It is the purest system of morality and firmest auxiliary and only stable support of all human laws. Christianity is part of the common law, end quote. Udegraph versus Commonwealth, 1826. And it just says, and this next one, it says, it just says, in 1844, in Philadelphia, a school took an unprecedented position. It would teach its students morality, but not Christianity. The court ruled it could not do so. The Bible and Christianity must be included in its instruction. Quote, why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as a divine revelation in the schools, its general precepts expounded, and its glorious principles of morality inculcated? Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament? End quote. That's Vidal versus Gerard's Executors, 1844. Now, as far as legally, was there ever, I guess what this Orthodox Christian was asking, was Christianity ever considered a Christian nation or something? I'm like, well, yeah, it obviously was. That's why I wanted to read here from this book. And it talks about the court's early rulings. We are a Christian nation. It says, in recent years, courts have often declared a need to understand the intent of the First Amendment before pronouncing a ruling on a pending case. The legal profession wrestles with intent because it is now more than 2 centuries removed from the minds of the framers. Is there nothing to document the intent of the founders? it would be logical that any rulers made by the courts in the years immediately following the framing of the Constitution would accurately reflect the founders' intent. Are those early accounts still available? Fortunately, they are. This chapter will examine several of those rulings, some dating back to 1795. In many of these cases, justices on the court had personally participated in drafting and ratifying the Constitution. When ruling on a case, they did not have to struggle with intent. They knew their own actions. In its rulings over the past 3 decades, the court has implied that the founders were vehemently opposed en masse to involving Christian principles in schools and government. If that is true, it will be reflected in the rulings of the early courts. The early decisions and commentaries will verify whether there is any validity to the doctrine of the separation of church and state as now enforced by the court. Excerpts from 15 early cases will be presented. So these 15 representing hundreds of similar cases illustrate the spirit and conclusions that pervade them all. This chapter will establish by court record that our founders would never have tolerated the separation of church and state as it now exists. Only in a nightmare could the founders have envisioned that what the court is now doing with the First Amendment. And this is where it talks about this Supreme Court case, Church of the Holy Trinity versus United States, versus United States, 1892. And this is in the United States Supreme Court. So this case provides a good starting point for its cities, several of the earlier sites. Several of the early cases, this case centered on an 1885 federal law concerning immigration, which declared, "It shall be unlawful for any person, company, partnership, or corporation in any manner whatsoever to in any way assist or encourage the importation of any alien or foreigners into the United States under the contract or agreement to perform labor or service of any kind." 2 years later, in 1887, the Church of the Holy Trinity in New York employed a clergyman from England and its pastor. That employment was challenged by the United States Attorney General's office as a violation of the law. So the case eventually reached the Supreme Court. The first half of the court's decision dealt with what it termed, quote, absurd, end quote, application of laws. The court was not saying that the legislation was absurd, for in the early years the court rarely criticized the legislature since it was the voice of the people. Quote, absurd, end quote, referred to the cases where an interpretation by the letter of the law and not by the spirit or intent of its framers would lead to absurd results. The court examined the congressional records of the hearings surrounding the legislation and established that from the legislators' own testimony that the law was enacted solely to preclude an influx of cheap and unskilled labor for work on the railroads. Although the church's alleged violation was certainly within the letter of the law, it was not within its spirit. The court concluded that only an, quote, absurd, end quote, application of the Constitution would allow a restriction on Christianity. It says no purpose of action against religion can be imputed to any legislation, state or national, because this is a religious people. This is a Christian nation. The court resolved the legal question within the first half of its written ruling, and devoted the remainder to establishing that this nation is indeed Christian, and why it should be constitutionally, quote, absurd, end quote, and legally impossible to legislate any restrictions on Christianity. Despite the court's use of only brief historical quotations, its references comprise 8 of the 16 passages in the decision. Justin Brewer, who delivered the opinion of the court, gave the basis for the court's conclusion. It says, "This is a religious people. This is historically true. From the discovery of this continent to the present hour, there is a single voice making this affirmation. The commission to Christopher Columbus recited that, quote, it is hoped that by God's assistance, some of the continents and islands in the ocean will be discovered," end quote. The first colonial grant made to Sir Walter Raleigh in 1584 and the grant authorizing him to enact statutes for the government of the proposed colony, providing that, quote, they be not against the true Christian faith, end quote. The first charter of Virginia, granted by King James I in 1606, commenced the grant in these words, quote, in propagating of Christian religion to such people as yet live in darkness, end quote. Language of similar import may be found in the subsequent charters of that colony in 1609 and 1611, and the same is true of the various charters granted to the other colonies. In language more or less emphatic is the establishment of the Christian religion, declared to be one of the purposes of the grant. The celebrated impact made by the Pilgrims in the Mayflower, 1620, recites, quote, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, end quote. The fundamental orders of Connecticut, under which a provisional government was instituted in 1638 through 1639, commenced with this declaration, quote, and well knowing where a people are gathered together, the word of God requires that, to maintain the peace and union, there should be an orderly and decent government established according to God, to maintain and preserve the liberty and purity of the gospel of our Lord Jesus, which we now profess, of the said gospel which is now practiced among us, in quote. In the Charter of Privileges granted by William Penn to the province of Pennsylvania in 1701 is recited, quote, no people can be truly happy, though under the greatest enjoyment of civil liberties, if abridged of their religious profession and worship, end quote. Coming nearer to the present time, the Declaration of Independence recognizes the presence of the divine in human affairs in these words, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, end quote. Quote, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the solicitude of our intentions, end quote. Quote, and for the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, end quote. The court continued with example after example, citing portions from the 44 state constitutions, the number of states in 1892. Using many of the same excerpts given in the book in earlier chapters, the court's historical discourse continued for several pages until finally summarizing its findings. It says, there is no dissonance in these declarations. There is a universal language pervading them all. Having one meaning, they affirm and reaffirm that this is a religious nation. These are not individual sayings, declarations of private persons. They are organic utterances. They speak the voice of the entire people. While because of a general recognition of this truth, the question has seldom been presented to the courts, yet we find that in Up de Graaf versus the Commonwealth, it was decided that, quote, Christianity, general Christianity, is and always has been a part of the common law, not Christianity with an established church, but Christianity with liberty of conscience to all men, end quote. And in the People versus Ruggles, Counselor Kent, the great commentator on American law, speaking as Chief Justice to the Supreme Court of New York, said, quote, the people of this state, in common with the people of this country, profess the general doctrines of Christianity and the rule of their faith and practice. We are a Christian people, and the morality of the country is deeply engrafted upon Christianity and not upon the doctrines of or worship of those impostors, other religions, end quote. And in the famous case of Vidal versus Garrard's executors, this court observed, quote, it is also said and truly that the Christian religion is a part of the common law, end quote. These and many other matters which might be noticed add a volume of unofficial declarations to the mass of organic utterances that this is a Christian nation. This stands as quite a convincing and broad-based argument. The court quoted directly from 18 sources, alluded to over 40 others, and acknowledged, quote, many other, end quote, and a, quote, a volume, end quote, more from which selections could have been made. The court cited People versus Ruggles, De Graaf versus Commonwealth, and Vidal versus Garrard's executors, In establishing its conclusion, the Ruggles case was decided by the Supreme Court of New York in 1811, Updegraff by the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania in 1826, and Vidal by the United States Supreme Court in 1844. Before reviewing these three cases, an observation needs to be made about cases stemming from state Supreme Courts. Currently, the federal Supreme Court is very high profile and affects national and private life through its far-reaching decisions. Consequently, a state Supreme Court is now perceived as a less credible source than the federal Supreme Court. However, this was not the attitude of early years. For 150 years after the ratification of the Constitution, the states were considered the highest source of authority. Most disputes went to higher than state courts, and only unusual circumstances would cause a case to go to the federal Supreme Court. This is i.e. disputes between states, cases involving federal territories and not yet states, cases not involving a jury decision, etc. Therefore, on items concerning religion and Christianity, the federal courts were considered less of an authority than the state courts, as the court itself had noted in the Holy Trinity case. It had a few occasions in which to decide on issues affecting Christianity, saying, well, because of a general recognition of this truth that we are a Christian nation, the question has seldom been presented to the courts. When the federal court did render a decision touching Christianity, it frequently cited the decisions of the state Supreme Courts as it did in Holy Trinity. It is helpful to keep this background information in mind when examining the following cases. And it just goes on to talk about other cases and stuff. So basically that proves there that legally it was considered a Christian nation, right? And so, which I consider it proper to its foundation. I'm sorry, I'm kind of tired. I'll just read this part. Congregational investigations. This is in the chapter of other, quote, organic utterances, in quotes. It says there were those in America who did seek what the Enlightenment had advanced, a total separation of church and state, since our founders had made it clear that Christian principles were to be included in all aspects of public affairs. Their attempts to use the courts to gain any semblance of a separation of Christianity from the government or public affairs have been completely unsuccessful, as evidenced in the previous chapter. Having failed in the courts, they turned their efforts to a different arena. They petitioned Congress to separate church and state, to remove chaplains from the congregational halls and from the military. These petitions were referred to the Judiciary Committee of Congress for consideration. These committees, after conducting extensive investigations into historical records and laws to determine if it would be appropriate to separate church and state, released their final report. And it said, in the Senate of the United States, January 1958, Mr. Badger made the following report. It said that the ground on which the petitioners found their prayer is that the provisions of law are in violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, which declares that, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, end quote. If thus becomes necessary to inquire whether the position of the petitioners is be correct, the clause speaks of quote, an establishment of religion, end quote. What is meant by that expression? They refer without a doubt to that establishment which existed in the mother country, and its meaning is to be ascertained by ascertaining what the establishment was. It was the connection with the state of a particular religious society, denomination. We are a Christian people, not because the law demands it, not to gain exclusive benefits or to avoid legal disabilities, but from choice and education, and in a land thus universally Christian, what is to be expected, what desired, but that we shall pay a due regard to Christianity. The whole new of the petitioners seemed founded upon mistaken conceptions of the meaning of the Constitution. They intended by this amendment to prohibit, quote, an establishment of religion, end quote, such as the English Church presented or anything like it, but they had no fear of or jealousy of religion itself, nor did they wish to see us as an irreligious people. they did not intend to spread over all the public authorities and the whole public action of the nation the dead and revolting spectacle of atheistic apathy. Not so had the battles of the Revolution been fought, and the deliberations of the Revolutionary Congress been conducted. So here is March 27, 1854. Mr. McCam from the House Committee of the Judiciary made the following report. The Committee on the Judiciary had the subject under consideration, and after careful examination are not prepared to come to the conclusion desired by the memorialists. Having made that decision, it is due that the reason should be given. At the adoption of the Constitution, we believe every state, certainly 10 of the 13, provided as regularly for the support of the Church as the support of the government. Had the people during the Revolution and a suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, that revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution and the amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged, not any one sect or denomination. If Christianity must be considered as the foundation on which the whole structure rests, laws will not have permanence or power without the sanction of religious sentiment, without a firm belief that there is a power above us that will reward our virtues and punish our vices. In this age, there can be no substitute for Christianity. That in its general principles is the great conservative element on which we must rely for the purity and permanence of free institutions. That was the religion of the founders of the Republic, and that they expected it to remain the religion of their descendants. There is a great and very prevalent error on the subject, and the opinion that those who organized this government did not legislate on religion. This is only 2 months later, the House passed a resolution declaring, it said, the great vital and conservative element in our system is the belief of our people in the pure doctrines and divine truths of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Those wanting to divorce God from government found no allies in either the courts or in Congress, right? So I don't know, so it is a pretty good book, so I hopefully, that answered, that Orthodox answer to show him legally if there was ever a Christian nation or something. And I'm saying that the Constitution and Declaration, they presuppose a new covenant reality. And so, the way I ground America in the Christian nation, right? Or the way I ground it as a Christian nation is in the New Covenant understanding. Because Christians, when you say Christian, then it's a Christian nation, it becomes ambiguous. What does that mean? Right? There are so many Christianities, and so that's what I'm saying, that Christians, are a New Covenant people. So as a Christian heritage, as a New Covenant heritage. And the New Covenant, there's only one New Covenant, right, of Christ. And so that's what I'm saying. It's really about the gospel of Christ, the faith of Christ, the God of Christ, the law of Christ, the religion of Christ, Jesus. So that is the foundation of what was venerated by the founders, because I told you that a lot of secularists think that that there was no religion that was favored, that they were all seen as equals, but no, they weren't. There was even the most even the so-called theistic founders favored the Christian religion as a superior religion. I read from you quotations from one of these books here, because I wanted to go over these books. But I could at least recommend to this Orthodox Christian, or to any Christian really that lives in America, because I don't find the secular interpretation, or its religious neutrality, or whatever you want to call it, I don't find that theistic, atheistic tendencies, that kind of America, I don't find that as a strong position. I think that's a weak position. And this other book, Religion and the Founders of the American Republic by James H. Hudson, is pretty good. It has packed pictures and stuff. It has a foreword by Jaroslav Pelikan. It's speaking of Benjamin Franklin. This is Benjamin Franklin, the embodiment of the Enlightenment in America, spoke as a theist when, in the last days of his life, he confided to Ezra Stiles that he had, quote, with most dissenters in England, some doubts as to Christ's divinity, end quote. The unusual thing about Franklin's statement was that he made it at all. So strong was the power of religious orthodoxy to compel conformity in 18th century America that the founding fathers obsessively concealed their religious opinions. If tinctured ever so slightly by the unconventional, the result has been a cottage industry among historians trying to puzzle out the religious convictions of the founders, leading to a stream of publications on such topics as, quote, was Alexander Hamilton a Christian statement, end quote. Hamilton, 1755 through 1804, in fact, is an instructive example of the perils of pinning religious labels on the founders. In college and as a young officer in the Continental Army, he was in the, quote, habit of praying on his knees night and day, end quote, and impressed friends as a, quote, zealous believer in the fundamental doctrines of Christianity, end quote. There is little information about Hamilton's religious views during midlife. On his deathbed, we find him imploring an Episcopal bishop to administer Holy Communion. When and what sense can he be considered a deist? So the same question can be asked about George Washington, 1732 through 1799, who is often described as a deist. Washington left behind no written evidence about his private religious convictions. Judging from his public conduct, he was a loyal Episcopalian. If he was a deist, he did not consider his views incompatible with full participation in his church, because for years he served faithfully as a member of his local vestry. The larger point here is that deism in America, such as it was, did not veer off into anti-clericalism as it did in Europe. It accommodated itself without exception to existing religious institutions. Deism certainly did not drain members off from the local churches, which continued to be remarkably robust on the eve of the American Revolution, contrary to the persistent notion that religion in 18th century America was progressively declining. A century ago, a writer claimed that during and after the Revolution, Christianity was, quote, at the lowest watermark of the lowest ebb tide, end quote. Other writers have simply said that religion during the Revolutionary era was in a state of, quote, depression, end quote. A recent study of church attendance reveals, however, that in 1776 about 71 and 77% of Americans may have filled the pews on Sundays. Another scholar research indicates that, quote, far from suffering decline, religion experienced vigorous growth and luxuriant development during the Revolutionary period, end quote. Quote, it is more accurate, end quote, continues this writer, quote, to characterize the years between 1775 and 1790 as a revolution and a revolutionary revival, end quote, the return on a smaller scale of the Great Awakening. Although the Awakening petered out in New England and in the Middle Colonies in the mid-1740s, supporters of the revivals in those areas, the New Lights in New England, and their theological soulmates, the New Side Presbyterians in the Middle Colonies, consolidated their strength in similar ways. Some New England New Lights, who initially separated from the established congregational churches, returned to the fold, and many more, however, became separate Baptists who absorbed the region's previously unfriendly, quote, Old Baptist, end quote, churches, and refreshed them with the evangelical spirit. The new denomination boomed, attracting by 1786 40,000 converts from other New England churches. Among these were many women who bonded during the Great Awakening and with their fellow Baptists in the spiritual egalitarianism of the new birth, acquired unprecedented authority in church governance. These gains, it has been argued recently, were rolled back by the impact of the American Revolution, which, though fought in the name of liberating the American people from oppression, had the ironic results in the religious sphere of subjecting women to, quote, gender subordination, end quote. The New Side Presbyterians also absorbed their Old Side adversaries after the denomination split in 1741. The Old Side is stagnated while the New Side flourished because of its ability to train its own ministers in crude but intellectually demanding, quote, law colleges, end quote, one of which evolved into Princeton University, and because of the evangelical sympathies of the Scottish-Irish immigrants who continued to swarm into the middle colonies. Recent investigations of the Scots-Irish have revealed them as the prototypical Anglo-American revivalists. Large-scale, passionate revivals discovered in Ulster as early as 1625 occurred with regularity thereafter in both Ulster and in Scotland itself, usually at 3 to 4 day, quote, communion seasons, end quote. George Whitefield preached at a revival in Scotland in 1742 that quote, far outdid all that I ever saw in America. For about an hour and a half, there was such weeping and so many falling into deep distress. That description is impossible. The people seemed to be smitten by scores. They were carried off and brought into the house like wounded soldiers taken from a field of battle, end quote. This is people bred on this sort of religious experience would naturally gravitate to the new side in America, and as they and their kinsmen spread along the frontiers of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and North Carolina, and then over the mountains into Kentucky, they left a powder trail, ready to be ignited by the first evangelical preachers who could catch up with them. The new and old side Presbyterians merged in 1758, but it was really a takeover by the new siders. They had 4 more ministers, 73 to 22, than the old side, and set the tone for the reunited denomination. Emerging from the awakening, the Presbyterians and Baptists were self-confident and energetic and full of fighting trim, ready to sally forth and battle Satan and stubborn strongholds. Beginning in the 1740s, New Side Presbyterian revivalists, led by Samuel Davies, 1723, 1761, began, quote, shaking the dry bones, end quote, in central Virginia. They were followed in the next decade by New England separate Baptists, led by Shubal Stearns, 1706 to 1771, who kindled a fervent revival at Sandy Creek, North Carolina. Throughout the remainder of the century, Presbyterians and Baptists poured missionaries into the South. In 1789, the Baptist patriarch himself, Isaac Bacchus, 1724 to 1806, conducted a 5-month mission in North Carolina and Virginia, setting in motion a cycle of revivals that rolled well into the 19th century. Baptists and Presbyterians found easy pickings in the Anglican South, where rationalistic clergy preached, quote, little else but morality, the great doctrines of universal depravity, redemption by the blood of Christ, and regeneration, end quote, seemed, according to the invading evangelists, to be relics of an earlier age. The revivalists imitated Whitefield's stage mannerisms. One celebrated Baptist minister, John Leland, 1754 through 1841, was accused of being too, quote, theatrical, end quote, and they preached his brand of old-fashioned Calvinism, stressing the sin from which mankind must be, quote, awakened, end quote, before conversion was possible. An Anglican priest, soured by seeing his parishioners picked off by the revivalists, assailed Presbyterian evangelists for preaching the, quote, terrors of the law, cursing and scolding, calling the old people gray-headed devils, and all promiscuously damned, double-damned lumps of hellfire, incarnate devils, 1,000 times worse than devils, etc., end quote. Displays of mass emotion followed these fusilids, as they had in New England and the middle colonies, but the, quote, celestial discord among the people, end quote, did not ruffle the evangelists, who considered it a prelude to their reception of the Holy Spirit and the advent of the new birth. Only on the eve of the American Revolution did the Methodists, founded in England by John Wesley, 1703 through 1791, in the 1730s as a reform movement within the Church of England, begin to make their mark. Their first circuit was not established in Virginia until 1774, but the next year they led revival in the central part of the state that, by 1778, produced 3 new circuits there and North Carolina, and in North Carolina. Nothing could stop the Methodists, not even being stigmatized as Tories because of Wesley's opposition to the American Revolution. By 1780, they had 106 churches. By 1790, 710. During this same period, separate Baptists brought the, quote, revolutionary revival, end quote, to northern New England by leading the, quote, New Light Stir, end quote, which spread from the Merrimack Valley in Massachusetts in 1779 to Maine, New Hampshire, and West Massachusetts by 1784. Meanwhile, Presbyterians reaped a, quote, rich harvest of converts, end quote, in the Concurrent Valley in Pennsylvania and in Southern Virginia.